Why do you think that the president chose to give a speech like this, which really was a plaintive call for Americans essentially to stand down and to stand up to the lies that we've seen about the previous election and apparently anticipating the potential that Republicans won't accept the results of this one? Why do you think he did that today?
Well, hello, Joy. It was a beautiful and heartfelt speech. I think that the president understands the enormous magnitude of the threats we're facing as a democratic society, as political violence continues to spiral in unpredictable and dangerous ways. And we don't have a clear-throated denunciation and renunciation of political violence by both of our major political parties and by all political figures. On the contrary, it seems like, even an episode as egregious as the attack on the Pelosi family could then become, the source of, ironic commentary and humor and derisive, trivializing statements by politicians. And so I think the president is really alarmed about what's going on. And, I'm glad he made that speech. I wish that he had put it somewhat more in a global context, because democracy is under siege all over the world. And we know that the forces that are undermining elections in America and attacking basic democratic institutions and values here are in league with autocrats and kleptocrats and theocrats abroad. And so the problem in some sense is even bigger than the president suggested here.
Right. And, in the context that you just gave, that there is an international context to the threats to democracy, it seems to me to be a problem that the only person who felt the need to give a national address to call upon Americans to do something that seems pretty basic, to accept the results of elections, but it's only coming from the leader of the party that already does accept elections. Right, that already does accept the results of when they lose. Hillary Clinton did that already. President Obama called Donald Trump when he became his successor. He even said he wasn't happy about it, but he did it. So do you see the problem being that there isn't anyone on the Republican side saying similar things? I think Mike Pence did a tweet, but there's no one with any moral gravitas or any, who can compel the other side who's saying anything like this.
Well, I think that's why Joe Biden wanted to speak this evening, not as the head of the Democratic Party, but rather as the president of the nation and the leader of the executive branch. And I think he struck the right tone for that. I think that as a Democrat with a big D, I would be talking about the fact also that democracy is not just a set of static institutions, but it's always a work in progress. It's unfinished. And so there are things in motion. We've got 713,000 tax-paying draftable citizens in Washington, D.C., where the president was speaking, who are the only residents of a national capital on earth who are not represented in their own Congress. We've got 3.5 million Americans in Puerto Rico who are seeking their statehood. So we need statehood admissions. We need a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to vote. We need to get rid of gerrymandering. So, I would try to invoke, in a more partisan political sense, the spirit of John Dewey, who said that the only solution to the ills of democracy is more democracy. And what we're suffering from today is all of the impediments and obstacles to democracy, the voter suppression tactics, the gerrymandering of our federal and state districts, the use of the filibuster to shut down voting rights legislation like the We the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and all the right-wing judicial activism that's undercutting the freedoms of the people. But the reason I liked the speech we just saw, Joy, was because Joe Biden was trying to strike that tone as the leader of the whole country. And well, he should, because as you're saying, there's nobody really attempting to do that on the other side. And so he needs to be speaking for all of America at this point.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, since I have you here and you are a member of the January 6th committee, when you all come out with your report, That is going to be about only the second time our Capitol has ever been attacked. The other time it was by the British, not even by fellow Americans. The ransacking of the Capitol for the purposes of denying the results of an election, for the very thing that the president spoke about tonight. Are you concerned that we are at a point now where there's nothing you could put in that report that is going to convince the third or whatever percentage of the country? The president says it's a minority of the other party, but it sure does seem like a very large plurality of the other party, that they will accept and take in as evidence that they ought to correct course. Because this is not a two-party problem. This is a one-party problem. And you've got a couple of Republicans on your committee, but it's not even clear that Republicans will listen to them. So are you concerned that there's nothing that your committee can do or say that would be enough evidence to get those who have an interest, a political interest, a financial interest, or whatever interest in maintaining the big lie to stand down?
Well, look, our responsibility is to history and to the people and the Congress, and not to the Democrats or the Republicans. And of course, there are millions of Americans who hate both political parties and are independents or Greens or libertarians or something else. You know, when the president said that, you know, there are election deniers on the ballot, he's absolutely right about that. And it's hard to think of anything more dangerous than putting an election denier in charge of an election. It's like putting, you know, a mob boss in charge of the police, or an arsonist as the fire chief for the town. I mean, that just doesn't work. And so I'm glad that message got through. That's not a partisan message. It goes across the spectrum. If somebody is willing to deny the clear results of an election, they shouldn't be running an election. And, you know, when the president said that, you know, people shouldn't be denying elections when it's clear who's won, I mean, I'd be willing even to grant, okay, you don't accept the election as it comes down from the administrative authorities, the election officials, but if you've had a challenge in court and the courts have rejected every allegation of electoral fraud and corruption, as more than 60 courts did with respect to Donald Trump's big lie about the 2020 election, then in a democratic society, you've got to accept that. What else can you do? You know, you really are positioning yourself outside of the constitutional order and the rule of law if you continue to try to claim that you somehow won. And it's also obviously a psychological malady too, because you are just cutting up against everything we understand about healthy mental functioning. There's no basis for what they're saying, and so they're spreading paranoia in the land.
Yeah, and it's incredibly dangerous, as we just saw for Mr. Pelosi and what happened to him. Congressman Jamie Raskin, thank you very much, sir. We really appreciate your time tonight.